Hi, this is Mashnu, and I've been looking at your game that you sent me. And you write in the game in the message that at that time you were rated 1350 and your opponent 1710. It's a big difference. I must say, when I look at your moves, I have the feeling that your strength was higher than 1350. Sometimes it happened that when people develop their playing strength very fast, their rating is always behind their strength. So I have the feeling that you were already stronger, even if your rating was officially 1350. You were playing stronger at that time. We see this many times when young people start developing in chess. Their development goes very fast and their rating goes always behind. So sometimes when I play against young players and I see that they are rated, let's say 1900, I always think, okay, this could be a above 2000 player in reality, real strength. So there's always an insecurity in this. But anyway, it was a very interesting game. It's very balanced, and let's have a look at the game, because you had a few questions, and I have some new alternatives as well. It was a Sicilian. You were playing black here, and you chose for the dragon variation, and this is all theory. Queen to d2, so it looks as if white is preparing to castle queenside, and then we would get a very tense position when white attacks on the king side and black tries to attack on the queen side with the rook on c8, and we have these beautiful examples in Grandmaster play with this positional sacrifice of rook takes c3 and those kind of exciting things. Now in the game, your opponent decided to keep it safe and castle kingside later, but he made a slight mistake in this next move. He played here h3, and I don't understand why he plays h3. Actually, I like more to be consistent and play f3 here with white to prepare g4 and h4 at once. So I was a bit surprised about this h3 idea. You continue with a6 now, and I think that you had a better move here, since white hasn't castled yet queenside. We are not sure if we will be able with black to attack on the queenside or not, and an important thing now is the center, that is, well, let's say controlled by white at the moment because of this pawn on e4. Later in the game you advanced the e-pawn, and this meant that your d6 pawn could become weak at a certain point. It was not dramatic in the game, but this is something to think about, that in these positions many times we see in Grandmaster games and a move that it looks at first sight strange, but it is very logical, and that is the move d5. So, well, you could say you lose a tempo because you move d6 and later d5, but if we look at the possible consequences, we see that, well, white is now forced to do something about this tension here, because otherwise you will take on e4. He cannot advance the pawn to e5, so taking on d5 is a very good alternative. Now knight takes d5, and because of this opening of the center, black gets more active play, options for dynamic play, and the king of white is still in the center. One variation that shows how dynamic this can become is the following variation. If white takes on d5 and you retake, and then he plays bishop to f3 attacking your queen can go to e5. Now you're pinning this bishop on e3, and we see of course that the c6 knight can be taken, and it looks as if white can win a pawn there. But let's have a look at what happens then. If white takes here on c6, now comes a big surprise. The big surprise is that black can play bishop to a6 now, preventing white from castling. We are sacrificing a rook on a8. If white takes this rook, we don't need to retake right now. There is a beautiful in-between move, and that is queen takes b2, attacking the rook on a1. If this rook is saved by rook to d1, then we win the queen with bishop to c3. So you see, this is well, of course it doesn't need to go like this. I mean, white doesn't need to take here on c6 and things like that, but it shows that opening the center leads to very active play. So I would like to recommend you to remember this idea of, in this type of positions, considering the move d6 d5. There are several grandmaster games where you see this move, and I've seen it especially in the so-called accelerated dragon defense. The accelerated dragon, Tifiakov, the grandmaster Tifiakov, from originally from Eastern Europe, but he lives in the Netherlands. He plays a lot this accelerated dragon variation in the Sicilian, and the move d6 d5 is one of the moves that we see a lot in his games. So, well, you could remember this idea. And in the game you played a6. Let's continue with the game now. White cancelled no kingside, so okay, it's not going to be a tense fight between two attacks, one on kingside, one on queenside. And now you continue with queen to c7. Very logical. This is very consistent in the sense that this is what the meaning was of your move a6 to control b5, so you can play queen to c7 without being bothered about knight appearing on b5. Now your opponent continued with f4 and you moved e5. This is what I was talking about in the beginning, that somehow d6 can become weak now. It's not a dramatic thing, but well, this could have been prevented by playing d5 first. So e5 is something, well, it's a bit of a risk as well positionally, since this d6 pawn can become weak. We see in some variations of the Sicilian defense, we see this move e5, and the question is whether white can exploit the weakness on d6 or not. That's always the question in this type of positions. Now knight takes c6 was played, you retook with a pawn, and here he played rook a to d1, so he's trying to go for this d6 weakness. You answered knight to e8 to defend the pawn. I think it's not a very pleasant move to make, knight to e8, so retreating your knight to the back rank and blocking a bit your rook, but well, it's necessary to defend this d6 pawn. I think there was not really a very good alternative to this. I think you just need to do this now. Knight to e8. He took on e5. You took with the bishop. So now this d6 pawn is very well defended, and white has an isolated pawn on e4. Perhaps in an endgame this can become important. Bishop to c4. Bishop to e6. A trade. So now we have nice 3 pawns all together. So this, eventually in an endgame, it could give us possibilities of creating a pass pawn in the center. But it's not middle. It's not endgame. It's still middle game. It takes on f8. King takes f8, and now queen rook to f1 check. King goes back to g8, and the queen goes to f2. So he's trying to attack on the f file, but actually this attack doesn't have really much future, since you can control the 7th rank easily with your queen, and well, right now the square f8 is the only possible danger, but you have many possibilities to defend this, and one of those is bishop to g7, what you played. You played bishop to d4, and here you continue with e5. I don't know if during the game you realized that you could take on d4, because the defense of f8 then is not necessary, because the queen is pinned, so he cannot play queen to f8 mate. So bishop takes d4 was possible, queen takes d4, and now you could try to go to an endgame similar to the endgame that you reached in the game, with the difference that you haven't committed yet which pawn in the center you are going to advance. So this gives keeps the option open to later advance the d pawn instead of the e pawn on e5. So perhaps this is a slightly better than the endgame that you reached in the game. Let's see now how the game continued. You played e5, bishop goes to e3, knight to f6. A very logical move, of course. Bishop to g5, he's attacking your f6. Knight, the rook goes to f8, of course. Now you have this possible threats of removing this knight, taking on e4. So he answers queen to h4, and now it looks like the pressure on f6 is becoming bigger and bigger. And here was your question that you thought, okay, your move was knight to d7 and you wondered if knight to h5 would be better. I don't think so. I don't think it's better than what you played. I did find another continuation that's very interesting, that gives you advantage, but I'll go first to knight to h5. Here, if black trades take, then we get this position where if we compare the pieces, well, your knight cannot go right now to f4, so it's a bit passive at the moment. The bishop is not also very active. Now your queen is standing better than his queen, because we have a possible, with black, a possible check on b6 and then activate the queen taking on b2, or if he prevents that first, then queen b6 check and then perhaps going to the center with the queen to d4, things like that. But the position, I think, is equal, because it's not that difficult to activate pieces or to start an advance in the center here for black. I think later it can happen with some preparation, of course. So, well, I think knight to h5 is an idea, but if we look at the knight itself, it doesn't improve his position. But I told you that I had found something else, and that is the move queen to b6 check right now. Queen b6 check. It leads to a very dynamic variation that gives black winning options. It's not totally won, but it gives possibilities to win. Here white has three options: king to h1, king to h2, or queen to f4. Well, also rook to f2, but that's just a self-pin. That's not good. Let's have a look first at king to h2. This is the easiest variation, because then there is this check on g4. The rook on f1 is undefended. So with this check, you simply win material. You win the exchange. So we can discard king to h2. Now king to h1, then follows rook takes, queen takes b2, attacking the knight. If white takes your knight on f6, then you take on c3, and now we see something very special happening, and that is that this bishop is now pinned because of, again, this undefended rook on f1. So that means that white must do something about this before he can retreat this bishop or take on g7. So for example, rook to f3 here, and then you can take on f6. After rook takes f6, rook takes f6, queen takes f6, we have reached this, well, let's say difficult queen's endgame, but it is favorable for black, because black has the initiative here, giving this check on e1. If king goes to h2, then you take this pawn. Of course, white can take on d6, but if we evaluate now this position, we see that black has won a pawn, and it is a potential promoting weapon. So it's a passed pawn that can become dangerous. This kind of endgames are not very predictable, of course, because of the open position of the king, and we always must look at all kind of different checks of white, and eventually perpetual checks and things like that. But this is a way of getting active play with black, with this move queen to b6 check. Now I'll go back now to the game, because that's where we left. It's here. Did I show every variation? No, wait a minute. There's one more that we need to examine, and that is queen to f2. So this check, we saw these two different options, queen to f2, and now we can take here on b2 immediately. So we threaten now to take on e4 because of attack of the queen. So queen goes to e3, and now black can play queen to b4, activating the queen again. And in fact we have won a pawn now, the pawn on b2. So here we can say that we have some advantage with black. The pressure on f6 is diminished because the queen is not longer pressuring there. So this is I think okay for black. Eventually white could try to attack on the other side here, but then we could simply go to d4 and trade queens, and after a queen trade then the position is better for black because of this advanced pawn here that can be defended with c5. The e4 pawn can become weak later, so this is a better endgame for black. Now let's return to the game now, because here you played knight to d7, trade of rooks, bishop d8, and queen to a7 check, queen to f2, trade of queens, knight e6, activating the knight, winning a tempo. The bishop goes to e7, and now more or less the only way to defend this is of course bishop to f8, and that means that we enter in a knight's endgame. One rule for knight's endgames is that the endgame is better for the player who has the better pawn structure. In this case, it's not difficult to. It's actually quite difficult to say whose pawn structure is better, since black has an isolated weak pawn on a6, but white has here an isolated pawn on e4. Black will try to, with some preparation, advance the d pawn to have a passed pawn in the center. Now white could later perhaps create a passed pawn on the queen side, or he could try to go with his king towards the king side and attack those pawns. These are very exciting and difficult to predict endgames. The game continued a bit longer. Knight to e2, you centralized your king, and your opponent did the same. c3 now, taking away the square d4 for your knight. g5, g3, d5. Now d5 is an important weapon, of course, to use. Now b4 was played by your opponent, and you went with the knight to c7, and here was your second question. You asked yourself whether it would be wise to go with the knight to g7, and then to e8, and then to d6, and then to c4. Of course, it looks very promising to do this. Eventually, by the way, d4 is an option. You mentioned that as well. The only thing is that, well, as a plan, this is good. It's very good to realize that, okay, I can reroute my knight and activate it and find the right strong points to position my knight, but it takes too much time. After we make such a plan, we have to start calculating variations to see whether it's possible to do this. And if we see that if we play knight to d7, really, king to d3, knight to e8, and now white has c4, so then actually he's solving this problem of the weak square on c4 where knight could go. We can play though here d4 and create a pass pawn, but this pawn is now blocked by the king and we don't have any chance of getting this through here, so it's like the position is getting static now. So well, knight to d7 to g7 and to e8 was possible, but white has time to solve this problem of c4 and d4. In the game you played knight to c7. I think this is this gives you more chances than knight to g7, because we keep everything still possible. Knight to a8, it's a nice creative idea of moving the knight still to c4, but using the square b6. If your opponent would have played a5 now, then you would have needed to return with the knight to c7. But then the b5 square becomes interesting, because from there we can start attacking the c3 pawn. So it leads to actually with knight to a8, you, let's say you're trying to persuade perhaps white to advance this pawn. He didn't in the game. He took on d5, you took back, and now he played b5, and now white is taking some risks. He's creating a pass pawn on the queen side, but this is not that simple, because this pawn on b5 cannot be supported by his brother of the c-file, and the knight can also not come easily to help this b5 pawn. So knight to b6, g4 was played, king to e6, and then knight to g3, and here a draw was agreed. And I examined this endgame a bit longer, and I came to the conclusion that black has winning chances. But I understand that in a game where you are sitting behind the board, this is move number 40. Probably this is the time that the thinking time is controlled. So a lot of tension is released, and you are both happy to achieve a draw. The position is a bit better for black because of this blockaded pass pawn and the option of black to try to penetrate here, take the c3 pawn or the pass pawn here. But we must calculate very well what happens on this side, what happens with the knight attacking the pawns here, and are the pass pawns later becoming dangerous here or not. Well, let me show you one variation that I found, and I understand that you agree a draw here in let's say in the practical sense, that trying to find this kind of variations behind the board, it needs so much calculation that it's not easy. We easily can make mistakes and miss something. Well, knight to f6 attacking h7, so h6, knight to g8. Now we can take here on b5, he takes on h7, we go to c4, and well, of course white is not allowed to let this c3 pawn fall, because then the d pawn will advance. So king to d2 is needed, knight to a4 to still take on c3, knight to f7 to attack g5, and now we can play a move that is important because he's not only attacking g5, he's attacking e5 as well. So we play e4 here, knight takes on g5, knight takes on c3, and now it becomes exciting because we both have pass pawns. The pass pawns of black are more advanced than the white ones, but the king of white is well placed to stop this black pawns. If h4, d4, h5, e3 check, king to e1, d3. Now it looks more promising for black. We are threatening to advance d2 check and d1 queening. So white must prevent this. He has no time to advance his own pawn. So knight to f3 to meet d2 with simply knight takes e2, pawn takes e2, king takes e2, and then the pawns are really dangerous. So king to d5 now. The idea of king to d5 is to advance the king to e4, chase away this knight so we can advance later. And here if white tries to advance, then we simply play this and continue attacking this knight, and we promote first with check. Now I'm sure that if you see this you think, oh my god, it's impossible for me to have seen this behind the board, and I must tell you, I wouldn't see this whole variation behind the board as well, because this is simply far too long. So this kind of things, I'll go back to the ending position in the game here. This kind of things, actually we simply must make a certain evaluation of the position here, and if we see that, well, perhaps we have some winning chances, we can try it. But I can fully understand that in this type of positions you agree or draw. If you are tired of the game, or if you see that your opponent was rated much higher than you were, then it's a good achievement to make a draw against him. Now in this variation that I show you in the end game, of course it can be played a bit better by white at a certain point, because he doesn't need to advance like crazy with this h pawn. Well, here this is still okay, but let's say here, no, after d3 is already actually completely finished, because here I played h6, but in fact there is no other way of playing this for white, because white cannot prevent the king going to e4 and advancing of the d pawn. Well, this is something homework homework for you and for me too. It's an interesting endgame to see how this could develop. But well, anyway, the game ended here with a draw, and I want to congratulate you with this game, because seeing at the ratings, you were 1350, he was 1710. It's a huge difference, and you played very well. I find that you played this game on a much higher level than 1350. So well, I hope you keep enjoying chess, and I hope you found this useful, this video. And well, I'll say goodbye now. If you like, you can go to my website and do a small donation, and I'll see you next time. Alright, thanks and best wishes.